Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. It's awesome that so many people are here to join us as well. And yeah, thank you so much for the really nice introduction. I appreciate it. Um, like was already mentioned, if there's any questions, anything as they come up, please don't be shy with them. I'm always open for questions and stuff. So we will have time at the end for them. Hopefully I cover a lot of what's going on. We'll sort of build our way up as we go through the talk and all of that. And just if anybody is coming from YouTube or knows me primarily from there, this one will be a little bit different, but we will have some live coding and stuff going on while we're here. So I'm going to share my screen. I believe it's this one. There we go. And, oh, 1 second. Sorry, can I? When I'm sharing my screen, can I see? It took away the preview of everybody, so I can't see anybody anymore. And I don't use Zoom enough to know how to turn that back on.
We can see you, it's fine.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Awesome. So yeah, we're gonna be talking about Flexbox versus Grid. Often seen as a bit of a battle, and it's not necessarily like these two things that you have to pick one or pick the other one. But actually, just before we get into it, all of these slides, you can get them and the examples. So kevinpowell.co/CSS Café will bring you to the slides. So if you do want to follow along or follow with the links, and this link that's right here will open up a collection on CodePen. So all of the CodePens I'll be doing are linked right there, but they're also linked through each slide as I bring them up. So yeah, you can get the slides nice and easily. So yeah, there's CSS layouts in general are something I think that people start struggling with a little bit early on. You learn things like background blue, color, green. We think CSS is pretty easy. And then you start getting into the world of layout and trying to get things where you want them to go with it on the screen. And you start realizing things are a little bit difficult. And today it doesn't help that we have two different choices with Flexbox and Grid. And it's an amazing thing that we have both of these. If anybody has been doing this as long as I have, you know the days before we had either one of them, and it sucked. We had to result in a lot of hacky solutions and other things. And then we got Flexbox, which solved most of our problems and actually is really, really wonderful. And then later came Grid. And I find what's happened is a lot of people that were around in the early days of Flexbox or before Grid really became a thing, they learned Flexbox. We learned how to do what we need with Flexbox. And then when Grid came out, they sort of looked at it and there was a lot going on with Grid. So I can solve my problems with Flexbox. I'm not going to bother with it. And more recently, I've actually seen the opposite a little bit, where a lot of people that are really new to CSS are finding Grid first and then using Grid for a lot of things. And I'm getting a lot of questions about like, how do I do this layout using Grid? And I'm like, no, that you should be using Flexbox for that. So how can we decide which one of the two of these we want to use in any given situation? And for me, the easiest way to make any decision isn't to focus on like the strengths and the weaknesses and let's like break everything down. It's to take the path of least resistance. So what's the easiest way I can make a decision with least cognitive load possible, the better. And it's a little bit of a strange analogy, but I do see it a little bit like when you're trying to pick a pair of shoes. And this is if you're doing for different tasks. So if you're going to go play soccer and you have your soccer cleats and you have a pair of dress shoes, you're going to go with the soccer cleats because there's they're purpose built for that, and you'd be sliding all over the place in your dress shoes. Or if you're going for a walk with your dog, you'll put on your running shoes and probably not your dress shoes because they're less comfortable, and probably not your soccer cleats because it'd be kind of awkward to walk on the pavement. For all of these, you're focusing on the strength of each one. You're going, this is what this shoe is made for, so I'm going to use it for that purpose. And it's the same thing when we're trying to decide between Flexbox and Grid, at least in my opinion. So yeah, we want to focus on what each one is the best at. And by focusing like this tool is really good at this, and this other one is really good at this, then it makes our life a lot easier than trying to sort of go through the weeds in it a little bit, because you can actually there's a lot of crossover between what each one can accomplish. But as we're going to see once we get into the examples, Sometimes trying to make the other one do something, you could do it with like one line. If maybe you can do something with one line in Flexbox that would take me 6 lines with Grid, or vice versa. So just focusing on that path of least resistance makes decision making a lot easier, which makes your life a lot easier. I do see a few people mentioning tables. So yeah, if ever anyone was in the days of table layout, I'm sure you appreciate both Flexbox and Grid a lot. And actually, just to sidetrack a little bit, Grid did get a lot of comparisons to tables early on, but hopefully people don't worry about that too much anymore. It's a lot better than making table-based layouts. So starting with the strengths of Flexbox. And Flexbox, I think, is the one where Flexbox is satisfying, because when we use Flexbox, something happens right away. You display Flex and we get a result. So the one thing with it is it does give the children a lot of control. So if we look at this CodePen example, we have 3 children right here. We just have really simple markup. I have a parent. There's 3 children in there with a bit of text in them. Nothing too complicated. And on that parent, if we just come and we say display flex, it gives us a flex layout. There we go. But you'll notice right away that we don't have 3 equal columns. We just get 3 columns. And part of that comes down to how the defaults are set up with Flexbox and how Flexbox works when it calculates how big things are going to be. We're going to talk more about that as we go through to understand why this is happening. But just to say that when we do this here, and we're doing it with Flexbox, the children are a large part of how the layout is being calculated when we first set it up. And even if we want to change things. So if I actually wanted these 3 columns to be the same, I can't really do that here on the parent. I could play around, I could try, but really what I'd have to do is to come here on the child, or each one of the children, and I'd have to come in and give them, there's a lot of different things. I could say width 100%. That's going to work. We'll get equal columns. I could do a flex basis of 100%, exact same result. Or I could even come in and do the common one. I'll let that reset. Flex of, is it 1 that people usually do? Yes, and that would also work. I've posted different solutions to this in getting these to be equal columns in the past on YouTube, and people always point to a different solution. But the main important thing to know here, and we're going to dive more into like why those were working and what's actually happening with them. But just the important thing to remember at this stage is the parent sets the stage and the children do have control over what's happening. So if I do want equal columns, I have to do that by going on the children and doing something to the children to ensure that we actually have 3 equal columns. And you want to be careful when you're using Flexbox. The reason that they're so different if we don't do this is related to the content that's inside of them. This one has a lot less content, so it's not as big, basically. As I said, we'll get into why that's happening in a minute. But often you don't actually get this imbalanced content like this. You have very similar amounts of content, and you do your display flex, and it looks like you have 3 equal columns. Just be careful with it, because sometimes it might be like one's 200 pixels, the next one's 220 pixels, and the next one's like 195 pixels. And to the eye, you don't really see it, but just be careful with that, because sometimes you get these weird imbalances that are sort of off by a little bit, but it's kind of not noticeable, and it's a little strange. So just to keep an eye on that. Unlike Flexbox, where like Flexbox, which the kids get a lot of control, or the children, with Grid, the parent is the dictator. The parent is completely in control of the layout. So in this case, if I came here and exact same layout, but we do a display of Grid, that's a little disappointing because nothing happens. This is always the one thing with Grid that's a little underwhelming when you're used to Flexbox, because you do your display Grid and then you have to do something else to actually get things to start falling into place. But unlike when I was using Flexbox, where I had to come on the children to make even columns, I stay on the parent now, and I do my display. I do my grid template columns, and then we can do, I'll just do it this way for now, with setting up 3 equal columns. And then the content will fit into those columns that are created. Because when we're using Grid, we're creating a grid, and then the children that are in there fit into those cells. So if I need 3 equal columns, I can set it all up right here and have 3 equal columns without any issues. So the one, somebody on my Discord made this, and I thought it was apropos, so I've stolen it and used it in a few different things that I've done. But it's a little bit like the relaxed parent versus the very strict parent, whereas you can see Flex being the more relaxed one, it sort of sets some ground rules, but it sort of lets the children do what they want. Whereas with Grid, it's the one, it's setting very strict rules and the children have to obey it completely. So yeah, a nice way to sort of make that little distinguishment between the two of them. There are ways, again, I mentioned off the top, that you can get this overlap and you can get Grid to behave a little bit more in a Flexboxy way. But I don't want to get into the weeds too much, as I said. We want to focus on sort of the bigger overview, the simple things, and instead of like, how can I change that column to be more like a Flexbox thing? We're not going to stress about that too much right now. Sorry, 1 second. There we go. I found the faces of everybody. So I'm going to put the grid view back on. There we go. It was underneath my chat. Okay. So yeah, I went, oh yeah. And because of this, and because the grid is very structured, and because Flexbox is, as its name sort of implies, more flexible, I don't like looking at it as this 1D versus 2D thing, because that's usually what you hear first. Grid is for 2D layouts and Flexbox is for 1D layouts. The 1D versus 2D it is a thing. Oh, as we just saw, we can create 1D layout. Oh yeah, as we saw, both can create 1D layouts. Here's a grid, here's with Flexbox. Grid can create and be very useful for just making 3 equal columns. And actually for making 3 equal columns, I use Grid now instead of Flexbox, or not 3, but if I need equal columns, I find it much easier to do with Grid now than I do with Flexbox, because I don't have to worry about the children. I'm setting the stage and I'm just putting whatever content I need in there. So both of them can create 1D layouts. Both of them can also create 2D layouts. And by 2D layouts, we just mean columns and rows at the same time. So with Flexbox, it's very easy to do. We have a display flex, and that gives us a whole bunch of columns. Everything gets turned into a column. And then we just add a flex wrap of wrap on there. And if it needs to wrap, the content falls into a second or a third row. So I have columns and rows happening. Same thing, we can do that with my display grid. And I can say, in this case, we do need to be more explicit. Whereas Flexbox is sort of just figuring it out based on the space that's available to it. Grid, we are saying, okay, I want 4 columns. And as we'll get to, there are ways of making that a bit more dynamic. But it's just to say that both of them can create a 2D layout or a 1D layout, but both of them in those layouts have their own strengths and weaknesses. A little bit of what we can see here and in the different behaviors between these 2D layouts. Where the truth comes in when it's 1D versus 2D is the grid is creating a 2D grid. So it's creating these cells, the children need to live in those cells, and it's really locked in. Flexbox, it can have multiple rows, multiple columns, but each row is independent of the previous one. And that's why in the example right now that you can see here, like the lorem, it's a very small one, it has no relation to this one that's below it. Whereas with grid, these two are sort of related to one another. They're both the same width. So these columns and these columns, there's no relationship between them. Each row is independent. So in that sense, it's 1D, and it's also a bit more 1D in how we can control things. We're usually controlling, well, we do have control over both axes, so it's a little bit of, I guess, a gray area. But yeah, just to say that both of them can do 1D versus 1D or 2D layouts. So I don't like being locked into that idea of like, I need a 2D layout, so I'm definitely using grid, or I need just something along the top, so I'm going to use Flexbox. I don't think it's I think you can get yourself into trouble if that's how you're approaching things, and that's often where I see people run into problems when they're using grid. They're trying to achieve something, it's because they're stuck in that mentality, whereas Flexbox might be the better solution for what they're trying to do. So Yeah, it's more about control. Flexbox, each row is independent from the other rows, whereas with grid, it's the full grid and the items just have to live on that grid. So it's a bit more structured. Goes back to that idea of Flexbox being more flexible, setting the stage, letting the children sort of do what they want. Grid being this dictator parent who's making sure everything is nice and orderly and following exactly what it's saying needs to be done. And this brings us to the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic sizing, which I think is one of the areas that doesn't get enough talk with CSS, and not enough people, it doesn't get brought up a lot. And because it's a really important part of how layouts work in CSS, it's a very important part of CSS. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of like really everything to do with it. But the big difference between the two of them is an intrinsic size is when the browser's figuring out how big something should be, whereas an extrinsic size is when you've declared a width, a specific width. This could even be a percentage. You say 50%, you're still telling it how big it should be. It should be 50% of its parent. But when you're saying like width 500 pixels, then you're saying this is exactly how big it should be. So the parent block is deciding the size. An intrinsic size is really dictated by the content that's inside of it. And by default, and you can play with this, you can get away from this, but by default, it's a little bit of this battle when it comes to Flexbox and Grid. Flexbox really, sorry, Grammarly keeps coming on for me there. Intrinsic sizing is very much what Flexbox is built on, relies on, and if anybody here doesn't use Firefox at all, I'd really recommend, if you're doing Flexbox and Grid stuff, diving in, because the layout dev tools stuff in Firefox for Flexbox is really enlightening. You can see a lot of what's going on and understand a lot more of how Flexbox, or how the browser engine is deciding how big things should be or small things should be when you're using Flexbox. And it's really, really interesting. We will look at it a little bit now because I am in Firefox at the moment. But yeah, there's a lot that goes in Flexbox. It's really complicated, really, on how it works. And but again, we'll try and keep it a little bit simple. But you can see like it figures out the content size of something. And then if it's allowed to shrink or it's allowed to grow, then it figures things out based on that. But the first thing Flexbox does before anything else, when you do a display flex, it looks at the children and it figures out the content size. Content size is key when it comes to Flexbox. And let's see this in action. So when we do our display flex, and I like putting a gap on here because I like being able to see separate things a little bit, and we can use gap with Flexbox now, except of course it's not working for some reason. There we go. So yeah, we have these items coming in here. And when I say intrinsic sizing, let's actually turn off my display flex for a second. When we have display block elements, they're still intrinsically sized because the browser's figuring out how big. I've never declared a size on them, but display block by default is the full width of the parent, basically. Auto's a little bit different than that, but more or less, we're just saying fill up the entire space available. When we do display flex, actually, let's go look at our dev tools and we'll see it directly in here. So if we go to my layout, we're gonna have to move this around a little bit. Layout, oh, here. So we can see the flex, and if I'm on a flex child, we can see the content size. And so the content size right now, it's based on the content that's in here. So in this case, the word lorem. If I come on to the next one, we can see the content size is 101 pixels. We can see this one's 140. So it's based completely on the size of the text that is there. It could be an image. Images with flex as flex children can be a little bit weird, but if they're in the div, it could have, we could see it happening there. It could be, your inputs. It could be whatever you have in there, labels, other things like that. But it's saying how big is the content that's in there, ideally without a line break, because you'll notice right now none of these are actually breaking lines. And that's how it actually calculates things. So if we come and look here, if we have one that's a lot longer, we can see that this had to break onto 2 lines, because if not, we'd have some overflow. Flex, if you use Flexbox, I'm sure you've run into situations where you get overflow because the space gets too small. But Flex does all it can to try and prevent overflow from happening. So it tries to get these to fit. And it does that by getting their intrinsic size. So it goes onto these items, and let's go onto this really long one that's right at the end here. And the size of it's 534.6 pixels. And it goes, well, that's how long it would be if there was no line breaks in here. I just had this one long string of text. If you have like 6 paragraphs, just because right now I just have like a string of text, if you have 6 paragraphs, it would be based on the longest paragraph that's in there. Or if you have like a long headline, whatever, it's always on the biggest piece of content there. And so it's getting the entire size of that, and it's going, well, this can't fit, but the default is flex shrink. So we're allowed to shrink things from there. And that's why we start getting line wrapping and things like that. But Flexbox always starts by looking at what the content size would be, which is actually interesting because content size, even if you're changing your border box or changing other things, doesn't worry about that. Like the box sizing border box, it doesn't take that. It's just looking at the content size to do all of the math here. You don't need to really dive into the nitty gritty. So if you're a little bit confused right now, don't worry too much about it, but just know this is why the children are so important with how Flexbox works, because it's looking at each child when it's determining the size of all these things to be able to figure out what to do. And then we have some shrinking going on, so it's allowed to shrink and move around. But it's really, the content size is super important for Flexbox when it's first working and first doing all its calculations and all its layout stuff. And this is a really, really good thing. This is what makes Flexbox so magical and so easy to work with compared to a lot of how we might have done things in the past, especially with table-based layouts. Floats sort of work in the same way. But here I sort of stole from Product Hunt a little bit of a layout here, just so we can look at an example, an action of what you might actually see. So let's just pretend Product Hunt had a dark mode. And I'm just going to turn on some outlines and borders so we can see how things are moving around a little bit in here. Actually, it's okay. So the first one is my comment box here. So this guy right here, we have a comment bubble and then how many comments we have. So we need them next to each other. We can just do a display flex. And as usual, it's so nice the gap is part of Flexbox now. If you have older browser support, I do feel bad that you might not be able to use it. But it's a nice way to get them to go next to each other. And actually, let's just go look at the markup here. I have my meta. In my meta, we have the comments, and then I just have my tags. I kept this really simple. So meta has 3 children in it. I want all 3 children to go next to each other. And so on the meta, I can just say we have a display flex and add a little gap so they space each other out. So we can see here's the 3 children. They're spaced out. The reason that this is really nice when we're using Flexbox, instead of trying to do this with Grid, is because if I wanted to do this, like right now, I literally just throw a display flex on there and then I can space them out with gap. If I was trying to do this with Grid instead, I'd have to say display grid. Then I'd have to go grid template columns, or maybe grid auto column, or you could change the flow and other stuff. But let's say we do grid template columns, and then I go, well, how big do I want them to be? Right now, we have 3, but maybe one would have 4. Another one might only have 2, because these are like the tags or whatever, or categories. So right now I have 2 on each, but maybe one would have 5 categories, or one might have 1 category. So then how do you play around with that? So you go like, how many columns do I need? For now, let's just do a 1FR, because that makes even columns. But then I run into this problem where they're super spaced out. Well, that sucks. Okay, well, let's come in here and try and do this with like, and again, there is a keyword here I could use, but let's just say we do 100 pixels, or maybe smaller even, 50 pixels, 50 pixels, 50 pixels. And well, it sort of works, but now this is breaking on 2 lines, but like some of them are like, in this case, free is good, but then the social network's breaking on this side with it becomes hard to deal with. And again, there are ways that we could actually get these columns to be more intrinsically based. There's keywords we could use, but why bother even worrying about that when I could just use display flex and it just works? And then if one of these ends up with extra stuff, it's fine. If free options are awesome, I don't know why, whatever, we have something that's longer, it just grows, it fits, everything works perfectly fine. I use this example. The common one that you usually see is navigations, because navigations, it's the same type of thing. You have some longer words, some shorter words. You just want them to go next to each other, and you want them to all be the size that they need to be, regardless of what's going on. So navigations, tags, anytime that you just need the content to be the size of the content, intrinsically sized, Flexbox is amazing, and it just works, and you don't have to think about it. You don't have to struggle with anything. You just use it, and there you go. Then we have Grid, and Grid is better when we want a more structured layout. Flexbox is when we need things just to go. We want them to do their own thing. And of course, actually just jumping back to this example for really fast, the other nice thing with this, and I've seen this come up more often, I don't know, I wasn't planning to look at this one, but CSS Tricks had recently done it. So let's see if they still have it, where they used it for their navigation. They have Flex on there. Oh no, they changed it, I forgot. They have the side scrolling now. In the previous design, they just used a Flex wrap. So if the content got too small, like the navigation just wrapped around and you could still see the whole navigation. You didn't need a hamburger menu. Flexbox is amazing for things like that, and it just works so well. So the same thing here. You throw a Flex wrap on these, it gets too small, they just start wrapping around, you're perfectly fine. Whereas with Grid, then you start getting these awkward layouts. So Grid is better when we have a more structured layout and we need everything to fall into place. I sort of hinted that we were going to look at this a little bit at the last one, but I didn't use it. But let's say we have the same layout that we just had. I've added a few extra items here. But this time what I've done is we have a product grid parent class, and then each product is inside there as its own div. Nothing too complicated. So I've already said display grid, and then we want to come in and say grid template columns. We'll start with what we did before. Maybe we'll do 2 columns. So I'm just saying 2 equal columns, basically. If you're not familiar with the FR unit, it's actually, I'm not 100% sure. I keep saying this, so I really hope I'm right, but I'm pretty sure it's based on the Flexbox algorithm in how it calculates things and the sizing of stuff, because it is like a flexible thing to make equal columns, like we can see. So I get 2 columns. Now the issue is at one point we're going to overflow. So we could use a media query, or you could say, we need 3 columns, we put 3 FRs. If ever you do have equal columns, we have the repeat syntax. So we can repeat how many times we want to repeat. Let's do it like we just had it. So we'll sort of level up as we go. So there, we have 3 equal columns. They're all behaving the same way. I didn't put a flex wrap on those, so they're not wrapping. So I won't worry about that right now. But we get that. Another thing that we can do to make it a bit more dynamic, though, just so it doesn't overflow, because the nice thing, display flex wrap, you know that you're not going to run into issues with overflows and other problems. Because Grid is a bit more structured, it's a little bit like, oh, am I going to need like 7 media queries to work with? But hopefully not, because you should be able to come in, or a lot of the time, instead of saying how many you want explicitly, we can do an auto fit. And autofit sort of says, figure it out based on the size that's available. It's going to determine how many the browser is going to figure out how many columns that could be there, depending on the rest of the information you give it. If ever you're looking and you see autofit and autofill, if you're looking at tutorials and other things like that, autofit is probably the one that you want. Autofill can create empty columns that just add, like, even if there's nothing in them, and it can be a little bit awkward. So I find autofit like 95% of the time is the one that you want. Where this gets a bit weird, and I think this is actually a little bit of what scares people away from Grid in the first place, is there's a lot of new things that are Grid exclusive that don't work anywhere else. And this is where we get into the world. We have autofit, which is something that is Grid only. Then we have min-max, which is something that's Grid only. But on my min-max, I can come in and basically you're saying, this is the smallest I want a column to be, and this is the biggest I want it to be. And the general rule of thumb is give it like a set size for the smallest. So let's just say 300 pixels. And then the biggest, just say 1 FR. So, it's allowed to be as small as 300 pixels, but if you want it to grow, it can grow and fill up more space. So if we take a look now, we get a kind of dynamic layout that's working, but it's very structured and it's working well. And we don't really run into any risk of overflow unless we go smaller than 300 pixels, because that's the smallest a column is allowed to be. The way this is actually working right now is it's based on, it knows each column has a minimum size of 300 pixels. So they're going to grow, grow, grow. But if it can shrink them down, so at this point it goes, you know what? I could fit 3 columns at 300 pixels next to each other. So I'm going to shrink them back down and squeeze another column in there. And then as soon as those columns get smaller than 300 pixels, it goes, oh, they can't be smaller than that. So we're going to go down to 2 columns. And because we have the 1FR that's here, they're allowed to stretch to fill up the rest of the space. So we create this like more structured layout, and I think I have a slide. We're going to find out in a second. If not, I'll jump back to here. Just to compare this to what would happen if we tried doing this with Flexbox, because it gets a little bit messy. Yeah, so here's the Flexbox version. If we wanted to try and do the same thing with Flexbox, so here's sort of where we left off before. But if we came in here and instead of doing a display grid and my grid template columns, if we said display flex, it's going to make my columns, and I go, okay, that's kind of fine, but now, well, that sucks. Well, we just saw that if I do a flex wrap of wrap, then we can sort of overcome those issues. And okay, that's sort of working, but oh, that's kind of annoying. We don't get this structured layout because with Flexbox, every row is independent of the other rows. And it's all based on the content that is inside of it by default. So here we have, this one has a shorter line and this one has a longer line. So this one, the default content size is bigger because the default content size is bigger. Flexbox is trying to make it as big as it can be, and then the algorithm is kicking in to try and shrink it down, but we get this sort of messy layout a little bit. Can you fix this? 100%. You could come in onto the product cards, set a size on them, and you could actually get this to work in a maybe not exactly the same way as our grid layout's working, but in a similar-ish way. But again, you're doing, I could do it with grid with 2 lines. So why come in with Flexbox, set flex, then do wrap, then go onto the children to try and play around with them to get them to behave? We probably need a flex grow on them as well to really get it to be as dynamic as we want it to be. So you sort of get this like back and forth where when you feel like you're fighting against how the default is behaving, it's a nice time to go, well, maybe the other one would work better for whatever I'm trying to achieve. Oh yeah, okay, I do have a slide for this, good. The one thing we did see with the grid is it can be problematic when we use the auto fit. I'm gonna exaggerate it a little bit here. So if we set the min-max size on here, say as 27 rem, sorry for switching between rem and pixels, but if we go to here, like it can cause side scrolling because this 27 rem is the smallest that they're allowed to be. So if you're on, a smaller phone, then you're going to get some overflow. So there is a way to actually overcome this and prevent that from happening. It's a little bit already, this is, I guess my biggest issue with grid is the syntax, like your lines. I'm used to CSS, everything is really short, like property value, property value, property value. With grid, you get these longer things that come in, which sometimes, it makes readability a little bit harder and other stuff. And here we have a min max, and then I'm actually going to come on here and we're going to write another one, which is a min function inside of here. And this is just pushing modern CSS a little bit. But with the min function here, we can say my 27 rem or 100%. And now you'd actually not get any overflow. You can see that they keep on shrinking down. So we get bigger, we get smaller as we're going. The way this is working with the min function saying choose the smaller of these 2 values. So if 100% is bigger than 27 rem, it's going to stick with the 27 rem. Or if we actually do run out of room and the 100% is smaller than 27, which only happens ever when we get to these small screen sizes, then it's going to switch over to this one instead and ignore this. So it's not very often you'd probably want to come in and use something like this, but if you're using grid template columns with this auto fit and a min max, it's the way to prevent weird sort of overflows and having to throw an extra media query in there along the way to fight with it or to prevent things from happening. So a little bonus tip right there. If you're not used to grid and if you're someone who's like very comfortable with Flexbox and you're looking at some of this going, that's really cool, but it just seems like a little bit much, trying to figure out some of these things. it's the same patterns that will keep on repeating themselves. It's just, you find like, okay, the values inside of these get changed a little bit, but there's not that much that you need to do. Grid's incredibly powerful, but there's only like display grid template columns. Most of the time you're done. Sometimes you come in with rows. Sometimes you're going to do a more complex layout like we're about to see. But a lot of the time you can do most of what you need with just a display grid and a grid template columns on it. So if anybody is hesitant towards going towards grid just because it seems like there's a lot, or you tried using it and you're just overwhelmed by all the properties, you can really simplify it and achieve like 80% of what you'll ever need to do with like 2 or 3 properties. So yeah, that's that. The one thing, I didn't make a slide for this, but this is one of those areas that a layout like this that I do get asked a lot about, where to be someone who's using grid to make this layout, but they actually want this last item to fill up the entire space. And that's something we can't do with grid, because if you're new to grid or you haven't been using grid, I would definitely, Chrome has the grid thing. Oops, wrong one. There we go. The grid inspector as well now. I still prefer Firefox's because everything's a little bit more, it's a little bigger and easier to see basically. But just turning it on, it lets you visualize the grid that you're working on. It makes life a lot easier. And this item, each item is in its own cell. So each grid item occupies its own cell and it lives there. The thing is, with a dynamic layout like this, right now, I wouldn't want this to stretch across too. Or if you want these guys to sort of be centered, there's no way of centering them because they're locked into this grid. The grid is the grid parent is setting the stage, and the children have to abide by that. There's no way of, okay, I could tell KMenu to span 2, but then it's going to span across these 2 here. If I had, so here maybe it's working, but then at this layout it's kind of awkward, and then down here it would actually break the entire layout because it would force a second column that the other ones aren't living on, and it could be actually a complete mess. So that's, if you don't like things living within the cells and you're going, this is too rigid, I need something that's a little bit more dynamic, or where things move around a little bit more, that's where Flexbox can come in and can allow those types of things. I think grid solved the problem that we often had by letting us do something like this, but just really fast. If you did want to do it with Flexbox, again, we put our flex wrap of wrap. And then we'd have to come on the children. So that's my product, just dot product. Whoops, sorry. Dot product. So here we could do a flex of 1 probably. And we sort of get that same idea coming on. But now you can see like these are stretching 2 across because each row is independent of the other rows. Warmy isn't looking at what's going on up here. And we do a flex inspection too. So we can see like the 2 rows are completely independent from one another and they're doing their own thing. So if you need this independence between your rows, Flexbox. If you need the rigid structure where the parent is in charge, then grid comes in. I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but I really want to hammer that home as much as I can through this. Cool. Yeah, got through that. One thing with that is grid, in my opinion, is a bit more plug and play, because we don't have to worry about how the sizing of things, right? Like we saw that the content size has a big impact when we're using Flexbox. If something has more content, it by default tries to be bigger or it tries to be smaller. So then you're setting widths or you're setting flex basis on something. And even if you do use like this flex 1 trick, flex is just a shorthand and it's going to set your flex basis. And basically it's just making sure the flex basis for all of them are the same, which is why they become equal columns. So grid becomes a little bit more plug and play, because when we had that grid one, I could put anything I want into one of those cells and it's going to live in that cell and just occupy that cell. Whereas with Flexbox, there's more of this dynamic thing going on. So you do have to control those children a little bit more. So for layouts, even just a simple 3-column layout or 4-column or 5-column layout, whatever it is you need, just being able to display grid auto columns, set up your columns how you need, make your equal columns, and then just plug content in there regardless of what the content is really, really cool. I didn't set up a demo for this. I should have put a link actually in this, because I've gone more into the math of how things are calculated in a CSS tricks article. But if with Flexbox, because everything is calculated based on the content size, if you put padding on one of these, even though you've set things up to be perfectly equal, that padding will throw your columns off if only one of them has padding. Whereas with grid, that can't happen. Grid, as I said, is much more structured, I see it as more plug and play. I set my layout out, and then the items just go into that layout. The other thing with grid, and as I was sort of alluding to, I think things that shy people away from it are that there's new properties and these weird values and things you've never seen before. It also has more upfront work. You do display flex, boom, you have columns. You might have to do some stuff to make those columns do what you want them to do, but they're there. It feels satisfying that something actually happened. Grid often involves more upfront work, but that work, it pays off in the long run. It's like anything else. You plan things out properly, you spend a lot of time in planning, and then the project goes a lot easier and a lot smoother. I don't use it all the time. When grid first came out, I used a bit of grid template areas, and then I'm like, this is wasting my time. I'm spending so much time setting up all these areas. I can just use my column numbers and stuff and spans and other things. Until I realized that grid template areas are amazing. So at one point, oh no, I forgot to open that in a new tab, but that's okay. And this is where I'll also prefix, or I'll mention it after, but we do have to be a little bit careful because I'm going to change the order of content here. And we have to be very, very careful when you're changing the order of content with CSS. But basically I've set up a grid here, and at small sizes, actually, let's comment this out just for now. I've done a few things. If you're wondering what the single line comments, I'm in SCSS or SAS, but I'm not using any nesting here that I know of. I just use it in CodePens because it's easier to comment out one line at a time instead of the bulk, like the regular CSS comments. So yeah, if you had something set up like this, what I've done is I've set up some grid template areas. And again, if we go to my inspect tool and I find my card, Chrome also shows you these, but the names are super, super tiny. Again, I like using Firefox because it makes it in your face. I can see the names of them. Now they're a bit hard to read. So both Chrome and Firefox do let you change the color of things as well, even though it's not the right color. Let's see what happens. There we go. So we can see, let me just undock this actually, so we can keep that on, but not take up any room. Perfect. So you can see the name, the image, the social, the role, the description. So I've set my grid template areas up, and it's basically allowing me to name each one of my cells. And then I can apply, I can just say my image goes in my grid area image, my UL goes in my social, my H2 goes in name, position goes in position, etc. One thing with this, you'll notice I haven't set up any columns, any rows. Sometimes you're going to do both, but sometimes you can get away with it without doing it. So here I've just have a single column that just goes straight down. But where the real power of this comes in is then inside a media query, I can completely change my layout without touching any of the children. Because I've already said each one of these lives in this grid area, I just have to redefine my grid, and all of those things go exactly where I'm telling them to do. So I don't have to try and move the individual pieces around. And this is what I said about being a bit more plug and play. The parent is in control. So, well, this doesn't matter too much. So we can just turn those on. And then I get the grid template areas. And when I turn that on, you're going to see my images here, my socials here, name, role, and description. So everything just goes where I've told it to go. If you're not familiar with grid template areas, it's just, I have my image, my name, I'm just putting them out. And because they're in like a single set of quotation marks, it's just implying that there should be two columns. That's it. So image, role, and then this is just spanning over two rows because I did image and then image here again. So it spans across both of those. If ever I wanted to change things around a little bit, I could say I don't actually want my social to be here. You can also have blank areas where there's nothing by putting a period. And then let's make a new one. I don't know why I would do it like this, but say we put a blank one, and then I do my social links all the way at the bottom. Then my social links just go all the way at the bottom. Or I could even, let's delete that one. I could come here and say I want my social next to my name, and then we get a blank one here, and then we get another blank one here, just because I want to keep 3, 3, and 3 columns across all of them. Or even we could have role and description like that. And then it just means that we redefine the grid and everything just falls into place where I'm telling it to go. I am relying on intrinsic sizing right now of things because I've never declared any rows or columns. But if you needed these to have specific widths on them or other things like that, you throw a grid template columns on there and you set up your template columns, and everything would work perfectly fine. The one thing I do want to say with this is because, and you can reorder content with Flexbox or with Grid. Sometimes you reverse content with Flexbox, for example. It can be a common thing to do. We do want to be very careful and just know that the order here is what's most important. So, I'm having my H2 at the top. I have my image. I have my list. And even, you know what, looking at that, maybe my list doesn't make much sense here. Maybe the list would actually make more sense if I put it down here at the bottom after the position, after their info, and then I get their social links. The nice thing is I can put this in the most logical order in my markup and just have it display in the order that the designer gave me here without worrying about it too much. And the reason that we need to be very careful with the order of things in our HTML is looking at it from an accessibility point of view. If a screen reader is coming through all of this and it's reading through that, and maybe the designer gave you something where the description visually is first, but the hierarchy of, visual hierarchy, the name is bold, it stands out. When I look at this, even if my name was somewhere else, I'd probably look at the name first. So visual hierarchy, which can draw our eye in the right direction, is very different from if a screen reader is coming through and reading the text on something. So Grid enables us to do that. But we also have focus points where here I have my social links. I can focus on them and keyboard navigate through them. And I don't know about you guys, but I keyboard navigate through forums all the time. And I've had some really funky experiences where I just get this weird order that pops up as I'm tabbing through some fields. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's really annoying. And I'm an abled user and I know I can see what's happening and there's no problems there. So you can just imagine for somebody who, if you have a visual impairment and it just can be a lot more confusing if things are going on or whatever it is. There's a lot of things that could come up. So just be really, if you are reordering content using either Flexbox or Grid, just be very aware of keeping the markup in the logical order that makes the most sense and relying on visual hierarchy if you do need to move things around. And if there's tab things that get moved around, sometimes you're stuck, you have a design, you have no choice, but just be very aware that it can cause a really disjointed experience sometimes if you are reordering things a lot, and especially when tab orders are involved with things. Yeah, there is. Oh, I just really fast. I see somebody, it came up why I'm using M's in my media query. So we'll do a little divergence here. It's really short. I started using M's in my media queries because of an article by Zell. If you just search up Zell, Z-E-L-L media query, you'll find it. It's an old article, but every time I test it, it still holds true. Where M was the only unit that is consistent across every browser when you're zooming in and out and doing different things on when the media query will actually come in and change your layouts. If you're using M or REM in your media queries, it does not look at the font size on your HTML or on your root. It actually looks at the browser's default setting. I don't know why, but this doesn't, it's the only time. Even M's here, and even if your parent has a different whatever it is, it will never look at the root font size. It looks at the browser settings. So whichever one you're using, it's always consistent. And for whatever reason, Safari acts differently than Chrome and Firefox. If you're using Pixels, it's not a big difference. If you've been using Pixels forever, don't feel like you just need to go and refactor all your projects. No one's going to know about it. But just a really quick side note on why I've been using M's. Cool. So yeah, rundown on just sort of everything we've gone over. Grid and Flexbox are both fantastic solutions, and they do work really well together. I don't think I mentioned that enough, actually. Just like in here, this is this is all Flexbox. Do I have my Grid one? There's my Grid one. We have the layout set up with Grid, and then inside there I have Flex items. I should probably put a wrap on those to prevent other issues from coming up, but just to say that whether you're using one or the other, it's not like this project is using Grid and this project is using Flexbox, which sometimes people do get stuck on. Each one for each layout, individual choice for whatever you're trying to achieve, and they work very, very, very well together. So don't feel like you're being pigeonholed or stuck because of a decision you made on something else or on the bigger part of the layout. Flexbox really shines when we want to rely on intrinsic sizing. We need little items to be as big as they need to be. Navigations, descriptions, tags, other things like that. Fantastic at doing all of that. And if it's wrapping, we want each row to be independent and separate from one another, like we saw here. If I want those rows to be independent and doing their own thing, Flexbox is your solution. If I need something where everything is more locked in, more structured, then that's where Grid comes in. We define the system. The parent is in control. It's creating the layout. Children can have an influence on that layout, but Grid is setting the stage, and the children sort of have to abide by what it's saying. And yeah, so the parent has complete control on the situation. These are just rules of thumb. Please don't take these as like, this is the end all be all complete thing. Kevin said this. You can 100%. There are times where you might run into a situation where you need to flip the script for whatever reason. There are exceptions to every single rule that are out there. There's probably people who see things differently than I do and are very successful at creating layouts. But I just find that taking this approach, focusing on the strengths of each one, reduces the decision making that we have to make, because I know I need a structured layout. I'm going to use Grid. I know I need something a little bit more flexible and moving around and everything. Then I can go with Flexbox. It's usually a good first step. You might at one point go, actually, I really need this to be Grid, even though I thought Flexbox would be the solution, or vice versa. There are times it will happen, but just taking that as your first step, especially if you're not sure or you have the decision to make, I think is a really good, at least stepping stone to get you in the right direction that will hopefully serve you well when you're trying to make these decisions. And for more resources, there's obviously, as was mentioned off the top, I have my own YouTube channel and my courses. I'd really recommend Small CSS by Stephanie Eccles if you're looking for little code snippets that use both Grid and Grid and Flexbox. So Flexbox Grid, CSS Grid, but there's lots of stuff centering things, intrinsic containers, responsive sidebars, tons of little snippets, and you can just get the code, and super, super useful resource if you're looking for simple things to get layouts the way you want. So just Small CSS, or just follow Stefan. She's always up to amazing stuff as well. I sort of went through a lot on this one, saying that layout, bigger picture layout is often what people use Grid for, not always the solution. It is a paid product, but there are free resources within it as well. This is by Hayden Pickering and Andy Bell, called Every Layout. It's an amazing resource. If you go through it, even on the free stuff though, you learn a lot about how Flexbox works. It sort of gets into like pushing it into the hackier side sometimes to get solutions to work really well, but really, really awesome resource if you want to deep dive Flexbox and see how you can achieve really cool layouts pretty simply using Flexbox. So really good one. And shout out to Adam Argyle and OpenProps, just because I've used it heavily to make these slides. Everything here was styled using OpenProps, which, if you don't know, it's sort of like Tailwind, but using custom properties instead of using classes for everything. So you're still writing CSS, but it's all just based on sort of predefined custom properties, and can MVP or something styled up quickly. Really, really good. And you can even push it and build design systems and stuff with it too. And yeah, that's everything for me.